All right, everyone, welcome to the first session of the Design Excellence Conference. I want to thank all of our sponsors for supporting the conference. Certainly a different way to be involved this year, but thanks for sticking with us and making this a really wonderful event. The session today is called How Does COVID-19 Change the Built Environment from an ADA Perspective? With speaker Jesus Lardizibal. And I want to thank McKinney York for being the sponsor of this particular session. Thanks, McKinney York. All right, Jesus, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. So I hope you can see the screen, see my monitor. And let me get us back to the beginning over here. And so thank you, Ingrid, for the introduction. And we were talking a little bit offline about doing presentations online and how smooth they've gone. So I hope to continue that streak of having technology cooperate with us. But today's topic is, how is COVID-19 changing design? And this is about, I think it's our fifth year presenting at the conference. And we've done a broad range of presentations from the TOS, ADA, fair housing to transition plans. And this year we decided to do something a little different, similar to what we did last year, and present a topic that's timely. The reason for this topic, it kind of coincided with work that we're doing with the city of Charlotte from an ADA perspective. But as we were wrapping up our project, COVID-19 hit and it changed the dynamics of work that we were doing. And then the city shifted in response to COVID-19 and determining what were essential functions or essential staff. And as they were making that shift, they included us in making sure that what they did or they were proposing to do met ADA requirements. So that's sort of the reason for this presentation, is to take the knowledge of working in this new environment and helping cities adjust. And so we'll be looking at what other cities are doing. As part of our research, we looked at peer cities for the city of Charlotte and to determine what they were doing and go over some of what we've learned there. And we have our standard AIA slide here, and we have our copyright slide. But the course outline is going to be pretty straightforward. We'll give a brief background of the ADA, and by brief I mean one slide. I think most of you are familiar with the ADA. We'll also talk about the impact of previous pandemics on design. Part of what we were tasked with is learning from history. What has history taught us in terms of pandemics and how to adjust to them? So we'll cover a little bit of that. And then how the pandemic has specifically impacted people with disabilities. And some of those are going to be fairly obvious, but there are some other impacts that maybe aren't as obvious, that we'll cover those. And we'll cover some recent design recommendations. So there are recommendations coming from many sources. For example, the AIA has several guidelines on how to reopen buildings, and also other architects and engineering firms have come out with recommendations. We'll look at some of those and kind of gather them all up and look at what those recommendations mean, and then have some closing thoughts. And I think we'll save questions for the end, but you can send them in via chat and we'll answer them. But we'll try and save them for the end, save those questions for the end. And so the ADA is a civil rights law. So we're not talking about the Texas Accessibility Standards, the TOS, which is a construction law. We'll be focusing on the ADA, which is a civil rights law. So again, the TOS comes into effect when you build something, but the ADA is always in effect. You're always protecting people's civil rights, specifically people with disabilities. It's enforced by the Department of Justice, DOJ, and it has 5 titles. So when it comes to design, we typically only talk about Title II and Title III of the ADA. But for this presentation, I wanted to highlight that the ADA covers more than just the built environment. So as you can see, it talks about employment. Title II is what most government agencies have to provide. Title III is where you get more into the technical standards, the door widths, turning radius, and so forth. Telecommunications now means something different. So back when it was signed in 1990, telecommunications was the term. In fact, the standards still have requirements for phone booths, so to show you how it's aged. But now website provisions, digital media falls under telecommunications, and then there are miscellaneous provisions just where sort of everything else falls in. So with this as a backdrop, that the ADA is always in effect and everything that you do must be compliant. And this specifically applies to government agencies and what they do and how they provide these services. So as government agencies shifted their essential services, they had to keep this in mind and make sure that whatever they provided was still accessible. So three previous pandemics that I want to discuss that we can pull information from are the 1850s cholera outbreak in Europe, the 1918 influenza pandemic here in the US, and the, 1930s tuberculosis in Europe. So the one in London, London had been experiencing a cholera outbreak that began in the 1830s and went through 1854. So, there were many concerns about this. People were trying to figure out, what was happening. And in fact, there was a strong suspicion that it was coming through the city's water supply. So at the time, London had these communal water pumps where you went to get your water. So each neighborhood or section of town had their own water pump. And in fact, you paid taxes to have a handle. So the whole neighborhood, the whole community could come and use the handle and use the pump. Well, there was a strong suspicion, not proven, but strong suspicion that the water supply was the issue. So the government took off the water handles and then required people to go further distances to get water that they knew was clean. And this seemed to stem the outbreak. But then in the early 1850s, people started protesting, saying that their taxes went to the water pump handle, that their rights were being violated. There were what were called, water handle pump protests. And so eventually the government was pressured into putting back the water pump handles, and people started using the water again. And of course, the outbreak worsened, and it was finally until it was proven that the water supply was the issue, that the pump handles were taken. And what eventually happened because of the outbreak is sanitation improved, and water lines were then introduced that went directly to homes, and there was the elimination of these pumps and getting water from a single source. Now, the 1918 epidemic, what many people were calling the Spanish flu, and specifically the impact that it had here in the U.S. was that we wanted to move to surfaces that could be easily cleaned, that would show the cleanliness to the eye, and so the subway tile became popular, and in fact, in many cities, was a requirement in new construction for bathrooms specifically. We also went from the tubs that had feet and sat above the ground to built-in tubs. This was, again, to ensure that you only clean the side of the tub and didn't have to get under it, because there's a big push to clean everything, clean every surface, and this would facilitate that. Then we also moved to porcelain fixtures. So before then, some of the fixtures varied in materials. Some were still wood, and so this move to porcelain fixtures took hold as a result of this. There's also a move to get away from upholstered materials, and so brass beds became popular. And one of the other interesting impacts is the 1930 New Deal. We can see the impact of the pandemic in it, because as federal funds were released to reflect the New Deal and reflect the construction that was happening, there was a correlation to the pandemic where previous to this, government funding didn't regulate construction in terms of residential. But because of this, if you had apartments or government housing, you had to have independent hallways. You had to have restrooms in each individual unit. You had to have fire escapes and so forth. And it also facilitated cleaning and maintenance of the new housing. The last one is the tuberculosis outbreak in Europe in the late 1920s, and it went in through the 30s. So the Paimio Sanatorium in Finland was a direct response to tuberculosis. So this is credited as being the first modern hospital, and it was part of the modernist movement. And the challenge was to create an 184-bed hospital. And this was the design that won, and it basically promoted windows and for both light and air circulation, metal surfaces and porcelain tile, again, for ease of cleaning, ease of disinfecting, and for it to provide a clean feel. It was also unique in that it provided individual patient rooms. And in fact, the patient rooms, now we promote hand sanitizers as you come in and out of facilities, in and out of rooms. And this hospital was one of the first to introduce the concept of having a lavatory as you entered a patient room. So you entered a patient room, you washed your hands, and as you left, you washed your hands again. And then they also had enclosed stations, so nursing stations or reception stations. The image in the top right has basically glass covering the entire station, because at the time it wasn't known how tuberculosis was spread, so you were trying to keep yourself as isolated as possible. So again, a pandemic led to the creation of what we see now as our modern hospitals. So all of that, because we'll be drawing back on some of these lessons learned for what we're going through now, but specifically the impact of COVID-19 on people with disabilities, and some of the ones that are most prominent or we're dealing with the most is the issue of masks and online participation. So as the pandemic started, there was of course a move to stop face-to-face meetings and move as much as possible online. Then the impact of social distancing and being able to stay 6 feet away from each other, and public meetings. As we worked with the city of Charlotte and other cities, there's still a need to collect public input, and we'll go more into how to manage some of that. So masks, as cities started to move to using masks, one of the things that started to become an issue was for people who have hearing disabilities that rely on reading lips. And for example, in Charlotte, this started to become an issue with emergency services, with first responders such as police, where police would show up with the mask and someone with a hearing disability then had a harder time communicating with the officer. And so now the city uses these types of masks, and so you can read lips. Of course, some people still need to be closer than 6 feet to be able to read your lips, which is, another kind of consideration or issue. But there's just something that hadn't been thought of until it was apparent that you needed to be able to provide an accommodation to people. And again, this is an ADA requirement. So since the city is governed by Title II of the ADA, they had to respond and come up with a different way to be able to effectively communicate with the public. Something else that has come about because of masks is people who don't want to wear them or have issues wearing them. And all of a sudden, people started having these cards that said that they were exempt from wearing masks because of a disability. And these are not provided by the Department of Justice. There is no agency that gives these cards or promotes these cards. People were just, magic of the internet. You could get these cards and say that you were exempt from it. But, and the people that, or some of the people that were using this supposed card were saying, look, I have a disability. You cannot ask me what my disability is. All I have to say is that I have a disability, and you cannot force me to wear a mask, which is not true. Think of the ADA as you cannot treat a person with a disability any differently than anybody else. But in this case, what DOJ has said is that if you are a business and you are requiring that everybody wear masks, then it extends to everybody. And if somebody doesn't want to wear a mask or cannot wear a mask, that you have the right to refuse service. So just some clarification on masks and how it impacts ADA, or the claim that because of ADA, you don't have to wear one. Now, the CDC does have some exemptions for people who can and can't wear masks, and we are told to rely on CDC exemptions, not on the ADA claim. And online participation, just like we're doing now, we are moving from webinars, or we are moving to webinars instead of the traditional in-person conferences. We're having virtual meetings. We are doing more shopping online. We are having medical appointments online. And something that is really impacting the community with disabilities is this concept of medical rationing. So, in some instances, people are saying, let's ration a particular drug because we're finding out that it's effective against COVID. And so these drugs are being held back in case they're needed. But in some instances, these drugs are needed on a regular basis for people with disabilities. And so they're having issues finding medicine. There's a case here in town where a person with a disability went to the hospital with COVID-19, and there's a lawsuit, and it claims that that person did not receive the proper medical care because there was a thought that since this person already had a disability and underlying medical issues, that they would instead give the more intense treatments to someone else who maybe had a better chance of survival. So, and we are seeing more and more of these claims. There are 2 in San Francisco, several others in California. Florida and Maryland is seeing similar lawsuits. So, this online movement is also impacting people in terms of shopping. Your websites need to be accessible and meet certain requirements, which in some cases are not, but we'll get more into that in a minute. So as we do these webinars, what we're finding out is that you still need to provide access digitally. And for example, the National ADA Symposium that's held every year, it was canceled this year, but they still did provide an online version of it, which was a scaled down version. And other other webinars or conferences that involve people with disabilities, such as the Nobility one that's held here in town that addresses digital accessibility. As we talk to people, we found out that there is part of that silver lining in that webinars are much easier for people with disabilities. And what we heard was while they miss, or well, we all miss the interaction with one another, that's kind of a place to go gather and exchange ideas. The things that people didn't miss, specifically people with disabilities, is the transportation hassles, the getting to the airport, the actual flight, um, issues with lodging, the accessibility of the host facility and nearby restaurants when you travel to a different city. So this, not this is an informal sort of finding that we found. By no means is a study or anything, but the people that we talked to pointed out that they definitely didn't miss dealing with these hassles, which is kind of still of an indictment on our built environment that people are provide or still have issues. And when we travel, one of our staff members uses a wheelchair, and we've experienced some of this, the hassles in transportation and things listed here. But um, overall, people still miss getting together, but there is that silver lining to it. And something that we see a lot now, and what I'm sure you guys are familiar with these images, the turning space and clear floor spaces that are required within the ADA and TOS and fair housing. And before, when we talked to designers, one of the biggest issues was having the space in a bathroom. And the 5-foot diameter circle, always seemed to be eating up a lot more real estate and, having to deal with the space. But we've gone from a 5-foot diameter circle to a 12-foot now, if you think in terms of social distancing. So now we need to keep 6 feet away from one another, so that makes it that 12-foot diameter circle, and us having to keep our space from one another. So I think if we are now designing towards the 12-foot requirement, if the COVID issue persists, then the 5-foot radius won't be an issue anymore. And we're going to look at some current design recommendations, and these come from various sources, architects, as I mentioned previously, the AIA, engineers. Several cities have put out design competitions to solve specific issues, and we'll go over what Baltimore is doing. And what we'll do, it's not meant as a critique or what should have been done. Instead, let's look at recommendations that are out there and look at them specifically through the lens of accessibility and ADA. And we ourselves are guilty of some of this. As we were making recommendations to the city of Charlotte, as we stopped and thought about it, we're like, oh no, wait, we forgot this specific element. So please don't take it as a, let's kind of poke holes at these recommendations, but let's look at them from a different perspective and see how accessibility applies. So there's, of course, the recommendation for social distancing, ground markings to designate where you are and aren't supposed to be in a space. There's a move to replace drinking fountains with water bottle fillers. There's this, again, a move to touchless features. So City of Charlotte is moving towards having all city-owned bathrooms be touchless. And density of gathering places, and then virtual meetings will go more over the impact of meetings of people with disabilities. So here's a strategy, and we'll make the presentation available, and at the bottom you see there'll be a hyperlink sort of to pointing you as a resource to where we're getting this information. And this was done for a school Brooklyn lab, and you see some of the at the bottom you see some of the contributors. And this is basically strategies that were developed for a school in terms of how to deal with COVID and how the design was changing midstream in response to COVID. So some of these strategies, that are common as we've discussed, avoid shared supplies, use smart technologies to allow for handless operation, install foot controls for doors, um, you know, move from drinking fountains to bottle fillers and so forth. Colored tape on floors to designate one-way movement. So you have hallways that are strictly one-way. Certain doors will be for entrance only, others will be for exit only. So there are many recommendations coming out of this particular strategy. They also, the same group looked at other countries to see what they were doing to come up with recommendations for this particular school and here in the US. And you can see how some countries are adapting in their move back to school. One on the left is something that a US school is doing. That is going to be their version of social distancing. On the right, some of these issues are already being had by schools that have students with cognitive disabilities, where having students sit too close to each other is not preferred. In fact, their circle or their diameter of circles here isn't 6 feet, but 8 feet. And so some schools have already adapted to this, and looking at schools that have students with cognitive disabilities that require this type of spacing could be part of the solution here. Now, the recommendations as far as social distancing also include different colored floors, different textures, and use of antimicrobial materials, going back to subway tile and metal, but also ensuring that they are not slick. And making these recommendations for office spaces, um, having your space designated maybe a little more formally instead of having the open office concept. There's now a move to sort of designate where you sit. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with these markings that we're seeing. This is where you're supposed to stand as you make your way through the queue to purchase what you're going to purchase. And you're giving instructions, through the signage. You're designating which way to go on this aisle. But the issue becomes, what if you have a visual disability? How do you let people know where they're supposed to stand, where they're supposed to wait, which way they're supposed to move within the space? And it's become an issue in stores where someone doesn't know where to stand, and now they're being verbally told. In fact, we saw this where, oh no, move to the left a little more, to the right, and kind of stand there. And of course, you don't want to go touch someone and move them to a spot, and they don't want to be touched. So how do you facilitate this? So the city of Charlotte is moving towards having tactile markings in buildings. These type of markings have been used previously at several locations, one out in the right of way, not necessarily as truncated domes to designate a curb ramp, but to delineate where you're supposed to be in terms of a pedestrian versus a bicycle. These are also being used as part of universal design in hospitals, specifically VA hospitals, where we're having veterans come back with cognitive disabilities, such as brain injuries. And these are used where people with a cognitive disability, hospitals themselves are pretty much like a labyrinth in some cases, and people would get lost as they would leave their patient room to go to maybe a rehab session. So these markings were used, and different colors or different symbols, so that you could find your way back if you just followed the blue stars or the red circles. And these markings are now, the city of Charlotte is experimenting with these markings in their buildings to designate where you're supposed to be, where you're supposed to wait, your 6 foot distance. And in fact, some stores, some retailers are also moving to kind of a stick down version of this. Baltimore has put out a design guidebook. And in fact, it was a competition. It solicited design ideas on how to facilitate social distancing. And this is some of the designs that they came up with using, you can see the footprints on the right side, using paints that are tactile and can either be epoxy or use gravel in them. And that way you can tactily designate where you're supposed to be. The move to do away with drinking fountains and use water bottle fillers, um, from a technical standpoint, the image on the left, if you are providing the high-low, or what is known as the high-low drinking fountain with a water bottle filler, that's fine, as long as your drinking fountains meet the requirements. Technically, you're fine as long as the water bottle filler is within reach range at the appropriate height. And there's also the standalone water bottle fillers. And some people have said, well, wait a minute, now you're discriminating. But if this is the only way that you are providing water is through water bottle filler, then everybody has to bring a water bottle, then that is not seen as discrimination. What would be an issue is what we're seeing some of now is the water bottle filler with just a single drinking fountain. That drinking fountain is either high or low, but the requirements are that you provide the high and the low, both, and the water bottle filler is optional, up to you if you want to use it. So the move to hands-free or touchless, as I mentioned before, restrooms, the city of Charlotte is moving to touchless restrooms. Elevators and doors are also having these features. So if we look at a single-user unisex restroom, the door would have a sensor that would make it touchless. Then the interior of the restroom itself would have dispensers and fixture operations that would be motion driven, so that you didn't have to touch either the toilet paper dispenser, the paper towel dispenser, your lavatory, or the water closet itself. And then of course you would have a sensor on the inside part of the door. And how this extends to multi-user restrooms is that the stalls, where you have multiple stalls, the stalls are now being outfitted with sensors and closing features, so you wouldn't have to use your hand to open even stall doors. But then we get into some other ideas that and how do they impact people with disabilities. The image on the left, which has that foot device where you stick your foot in it and pull the door open so you don't have to open it with your hands. Again, if you have a mobility issue, or if you use a wheelchair or use crutches, a cane, you might not be able to operate that way. The middle image is from a manufacturer who says that they have touchless door sensors, but you can clearly see that it says push to open, and you still have to push it. So I don't know how touchless or hands-free that is. And then the image on the right, these sensors where you wave, and the motion is what then triggers a door opening or some action to happen. But if you have a visual disability, how do you know where to go wave to actuate the movement? Hands-free elevators. So the two images on the left are from Thailand. So Thailand has moved to this hands-free operations, and this was done several years ago in response to SARS. And some elevators have remained this way, where instead of you pushing buttons traditionally, like you traditionally do, you use pedals. And you push on the pedal, and on the image on the left, you can see how the traditional buttons have been covered up so that you cannot push them. You rely on your feet to do it. So again, if you are a person who uses a wheelchair or have a mobility issue, you might not be able to push the buttons or the pedals. And if you have a visual disability, it'd be hard to figure out which button takes you where. The middle image shows you out in the hallway, the elevator lobby. You can have the up and down button or pedals, but you can also see this black box where they've covered up the traditional buttons. So it's a solution, but we need to be cognizant of what it means for people with disabilities. The city of Charlotte is considering using something similar to the image on the right, where you use an app on your smartphone to operate the elevator. If you're a city employee, the app will be built in. The elevator would recognize you and take you to your floor. But if you need to go to a different floor, you use the app to take you to that different floor. However, not everybody uses a smartphone, and in the questionnaires going out by the city to staff, it hasn't been received with the greatest of enthusiasm. Now there's issues or concerns of, well, now I'm being tracked where I'm going and so forth. And then if you are not an employee, but you're a resident and coming to meet with city officials to go over your permit application or anything like that, then you also need to download this app and be able to use it to use the elevators. So, you know, there are solutions out there, but they all need to be vetted. And from our perspective, we're looking at it through the lens of people with disabilities. So, you know, going back to our move to virtual town hall meetings, there's still a need to gather public input, specifically in municipal type contracts where we are still seeking input from stakeholders. And you also have this want and need for equity in the input that you receive. You don't want to get input from just a single demographic. You want to reach out to different demographics and get this input. And this was challenging enough. Believe me, we've done plenty of town hall meetings where we specifically solicit input from people with disabilities or anybody interested in the topic of the built environment. And so, you know, having to get this input, and how do you do it in a way that is equitable and that makes sense, that will attract people to you, or you go out to where people are. In some instances, we've gone out to parks and so forth to get input. We've lucked out where we've gone to a park and there was a league specifically for people with disabilities, so being able to capture input there. But even if you look at City of Austin projects and current RFPs and RFQs, there's still this need for public input and this emphasis on equity. So now as we move to virtual platforms of these type of town hall meetings, what we're finding out is that you still have to have people who can access technology. And how, you know, can people get to the internet? Do they have the hardware to get on it? And then access to the content. We've seen some pretty slick software that, you know, for example, if you had the traditional town hall meeting where you had booths set up or stations and you go from station to station to gather information and to give your input, now it's done virtually so that you click on, for example, if you have a station that's specifically about transportation, you click on that station and it gives this information to you. Now, whether or not that information is accessible is a completely different thing, but it needs to be accessible so that someone who is either has a visual disability or a hearing disability can still participate. You need to close or open caption any videos that you're doing. So it provides some challenges, but again, some people like the virtual platform as long as it's accessible and works for them, because now you don't have to get to a specific location. So there are pros and cons to it, definitely. We're working on a project in Maryland where the county is moving towards these what are known as floating bus stops. And you've seen some of these along Guadalupe in front of the university, in front of the co-op. And it's basically, you have a sidewalk, then immediately after the sidewalk, you have a bike lane, then you have a bus stop. So it involves a couple of level changes, and it involves now you having to be aware of a bike lane. And as this project was moving forward and these concepts were being released, there was going to be bus stops placed in front of a school for the blind. Another one that was going to be placed at a rehabilitative service that helps rehabilitate people who have lost their vision recently. And then another was going to be placed at a government facility that provides services specifically to people with a visual disability. So there was a big concern, as you can expect, for people with disabilities saying, well, wait a minute, how do we know where we are in space? Where are these bike lanes? You know, help explain this to me. So doing this virtually presented challenges because typically a model would be done so that it could be felt tactily, and you would run your fingers through the model and it would explain, somebody would verbally explain, here's the sidewalk, here's the bike lane, here's the bus stop. But now, of course, doing this virtually presented its own challenges. So we had to come up with a 3D model to represent what was being done, and it had to be tactile. We had to be produced on demand as people wanted these, and it had to be mailed to residents because, of course, we weren't gathering traditionally anymore, and it was intended to be a one-time use. So you send it to people, then they keep it. So we worked with several organizations that to help us come up with a model, and a relief is what was decided upon as the best way to do this. This type of model would represent the building face on the far right, then the sidewalk, the level change for the bike lane, then the level change to get you back up to the bus stop platform. And the original thought was to have it extend the full cross section of the street to show the other side, but what we were advised is that um, the smaller, the better, because it conveys the message. If it's too large a model, people might get lost or the ideas might get lost in it. We're also told to keep things as best we could to scale, so not exaggerate too much one piece or another. And we have a model builder in our office who was a model builder in Venice, Italy, and so she jumped at the idea to start creating these. You know, we did some on 3D printers, and then she also built some on her own because there was a desire from the community to have different textures, and you can see the different textures here to convey the message. And so these are being mailed out right now to people who are requesting them, who want to have a tactile model that they can use to get a better idea of what's being described to them. And some other examples of implementing social distancing in outdoor spaces. I think the image on the left has been circulating. There was a concert in the UK. And so you had a platform, a raised platform, and you and your group stayed in that platform so you could socially distance. We've inquired to see if accessible platforms were provided, but we haven't heard back from them. We've also seen where you have almost like a drive-in concert where you drive in with your car and park, and you stay in your car and see a concert. But going back to the Baltimore design for distancing, you can see what they've done on the right, where they've again created a visual representation of how you should be distanced. It was originally done with chalk, but now they're going back and using gravel to provide that tactile difference of where you're supposed to be. So providing a thin line of gravel or some other detectable surface to designate where you're supposed to be is again an example of what's happening in Baltimore. Something else that the city of Charlotte was looking at in conjunction with the ADA transition plan that we were doing with them, they were also rewriting their citywide master plan and their development code. And there was a move to get away from kind of these dense locations for supermarkets where you had to drive or take transit to specific locations. And so there's consideration given to what are known as hyper-local markets, where you had smaller markets distributed more evenly throughout the city. And this was something that was being looked at as part, again, of the city's overall development code, and to try and encourage more of these markets, you know, smaller farmer market type of locations within the city. And as we started looking at some of these concepts, you know, they make sense. And they were already thinking in terms of social distancing. So you take either a parking lot, a park, and you convert them into markets at certain times of the week, and you have your social distancing requirements. You dictate the flow of movement, where you go from one vendor to another. You come in through one location and you exit another. And so this is currently going to be tried in Charlotte, and you can see how it applies in terms of COVID. But now some of the challenges are, of course, having the tactile designations of where you wait, where you go, how you enter, and payment methods. How do you make that as touchless as possible? So just another idea that was being presented to the city of Charlotte in terms of their code, and then taking that application and using, overlaying COVID to it, and then making sure that, again, it's accessible. And some of the closing thoughts as we wind down the presentation is that somebody has probably already thought or has a similar problem facing them. And what we found is that universal design already has a lot of built-in solutions. So look to universal design. We found a lot of great ideas in what's been done there. Or for example, schools that have people with disabilities, how are they adjusting um, to what's happening now? And of course, now is the time for innovation, as we talked about the impact of previous pandemics on design and just on our daily lives. Now is the time for innovation. We're seeing a lot of great ideas, a lot of great recommendations come out, and I think it'll continue to evolve. And as these ideas and considerations are presented, please consider accessibility. Consider people with a visual disability, a hearing disability, mobility issues. How are these solutions going to impact them? Think in broader terms. And we often hear, that there's going to be a new normal, and that we get to determine what that new normal is. And I highly encourage you to make that new normal inclusive. That's what we've been tasked with doing, in Charlotte and in Maryland, is as the city comes up with ideas, or the county comes up with ideas of providing a program or service, we then look at it through the ADA perspective and make sure that it works, that it applies to whatever it is that the city is trying to accomplish ultimately. So I think we should all do that as this continues to evolve. And that concludes the presentation, and wanted to open up to any questions. I do see a question that came in from Audra B regarding the high-low drinking fountains with bottle fillers. If a high-low is provided elsewhere in the same space, is the water bottle filler still not compliant if it stands alone? No, as long as you provide the required high-low, and those high-low are accessible, then the standalone water bottle filler will suffice. That'll be fine. It doesn't have to be adjacent or built into the drinking fountain. Are there any other questions?
Julie, it looks like there's one in the chat.
One in the chat. I am trying to see. Ingrid, how do I get to the chat?
It's an icon at the bottom of your screen. I can read it out loud if you like.
That'd be great. I
Sure.
can't find it.
It's from William Massengill. He says, seems like social distancing at major entertainment events will lead to skyrocketing street value than face value ticket costs for attendees. And he says this is a really good presentation.
Oh, well, thank you. Appreciate it. And yes, what the current pandemic is kind of forcing us to reanalyze is this concept of real estate and space. I think, space has always been at a premium, and how do we maximize space? And I think typically the notion was, let's cram in as many people as possible into a single space and maximize it. But I think maybe temporarily, but it might go on further. We need to rethink that in terms of getting value. And for example, a concert, I think we're all craving social interaction in concerts, and um, you might have to raise the price a little, but I think for some people it'll still be worth it, and that'll just be something that continues to evolve. Hospital designs, I think in the last 10 to 15 years, have had almost a pro forma associated with it for a number of beds that you could squeeze into a hospital. And I think now the thought is, we might need to go back and think more in terms of um, how do we convert a standard unit to an ICU unit or to a COVID unit. So our concept of real estate and use within buildings is definitely changing.
Chewy, there's another question in the chat from Sutaria. Are hands-free fixtures available in the market at reasonable cost?
Reasonable costs, yes. um, we found that they vary, and I don't have exact numbers for you. I can get some. The if you think of the automatic door push buttons that you see where you push a button and it opens a door to let you in, those have become pretty standard and not that cost prohibitive if done at the time of new construction. If you have to alter it and go back and rewire, that's a different issue. And I think that's what the city of Charlotte is facing now, is going back and retrofitting some of their facilities. So in a retrofit scenario, it's definitely going to cost you a little more specific to doors. But the other sensors, I think, are relatively affordable or reasonably affordable. Uh, we've seen the lavatory faucets have the sensors, the water closets have the sensors already in them, the urinals do. So I think you can find them at a reasonable cost. The door sensors, I think, and the door openers are going to be the ones that are going to be the more expensive.
And there's another question in the Q&A, Chewy. Do you see that one?
Yes. And this comes from Edward Young. Do you foresee any changes to multifamily housing design due to COVID? It's a great question. Where we're seeing it now is in single family designs where there's, well, first of all, taking a step back, even pre-COVID, some of the designs that were being kind of demanded, if you will, by this generation was to do away with kind of a dining room, because the gathering to eat a meal maybe wasn't as needed anymore, where people could eat wherever in the house. And what we're seeing now in single family is the or want for an extra bedroom. And what people have said, and now anecdotally is, oh, I'm really glad I had the guest bedroom, because in the need to self-isolate or quarantine, we can have the guest bedroom, and having the guest bedroom with a attached bathroom so you can truly quarantine people. We've seen a desire for that. In multifamily, I think what we're seeing is actually a desire for open spaces, a place where you can go and be outdoors. And now with working from home, I still don't know how much of an impact we'll see in terms of the design aspect. I know there has been a big demand for smaller workstations where you can go buy, instead of having a desk or a big table. I think a lot of us maybe are using our dining tables as part of our desks, but having smaller desks that you can move around the house, we're seeing that. But specific to multifamily, I haven't seen any design impacts yet. I'm assuming the amenities might be different. Instead of having the theater or the weight room, some of that, might be changing. in the future, but as of now, we haven't, I personally haven't seen a design impact. And I see a question from Alan. Do you know of development of materials or technologies to sanitize Braille between users? No, I do not. The, you know, the use of Braille, especially on signage, let's say to a restroom or another permanent space, I'm assuming this is the type of application you're thinking of, and we really haven't seen that material specifically addressing, being able to be sanitized. What we learned from other pandemics is the move to metal seems to be better. It's easier to clean, more durable, can withstand chemical cleaning agents applied to it. But I think as of now, it's more of the hand sanitizer, sanitize your hand after you touch, whatever it is that you do come in contact with, but have not seen a direct material application yet. And and doing research, one of the quotes from, I believe, is an article in the New Yorker, and an architect was quoted as saying that architects are best, when they have an opportunity to innovate. And I think, now's the time, especially with these questions that are being asked, now is the time to innovate and come up with some of these solutions that as we move forward. And so I think these questions, reflect that, and that how can we tackle this? How can we tackle that? And I think asking that question is the first step. And kind of feel like I'm giving you almost politician answers because I don't have the true answer for you other than let's talk through it and see if we can come up with the best solution. And it looks like Don, you started to have a question, and I think it was related to something with the foot pedals. But I only got part of the question, Don. So if you want to send me the whole question. Yes, and here comes the question. Do foot door openers not violate the 10-inch smooth door requirement? Great question, Don. That requirement is on the push side of the door, not on the pull side of the door. So as long as you have that foot pull, let's call it the foot pull, on the pull side, you're fine.
Julie, I'm seeing another question in the chat. Are lavatories being spaced further apart in public restrooms to 6 feet apart?
So what we're seeing, we haven't seen it translate directly to designs yet. So, we look at designs every day. We do plan reviews. And we haven't seen it translate to that quite yet. Where we're seeing it in the built environment, we went and did a couple inspections on campus at UT. And first of all, that's the most, just, it was amazing to be on campus and not have anybody around. I think we stood in front of the main building and maybe saw, and we were there for 5 minutes waiting for someone to allow us into a locked building, and we saw 2 people. And so it's pretty interesting. But as we walk through the campus, you can see where some lavatories have been sealed off. I mean, it's tape, but it's taped off, do not use. So you're forced to use every other lavatory. Same in the urinals. They've taped up the stalls at urinals saying use every other one. So we're seeing people adapt to it, right now, where they're going to use social distancing that way, but we haven't seen it translate directly to design yet, where you are having that that space allocated in design. And we have another one from William Massengill. Seems like signage manufacturers might be hopefully developing antimicrobial coating for at least Braille signage. And yes, that is the hope that that would be developed, but we haven't seen it yet.
I think we're out of time, but that was great. Thank you,
All
Chief.
right. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Ingrid, I'll send you the presentation in case anybody would like a copy of it.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone
Thank you.
for joining us, and we'll see you in the keynote at 9:30.
Thank you.